The Last Shawl, Week 1, The Small Grave. County Clare, Ireland, March 1847. The wind came in from the Atlantic with a bitterness that seemed to belong to another world. It swept over the bare fields outside Kilrush, bending the blackened stalks that had once promised potatoes enough to see another year. Now there was only ruined earth. 5 figures stood in silence beside a tiny grave. Patrick Dunne removed his cap. His wife, Eileen, clutched the worn wool shawl tightly around her shoulders, though it offered little protection from the cold. It had belonged to her grandmother before passing it to her mother, who had wrapped Eileen in it on the morning of her wedding 15 years before. It was the last beautiful thing they owned. Beside them stood their children. Mary, 13, thin beyond her years, held the hand of her little sister Bridget, who had only recently turned 8. Next to Patrick stood 11-year-old Michael. Michael should have looked like any healthy farm boy. Instead, his face was pale, his cheeks hollow, and every few moments a dry cough escaped him, despite his best efforts to hide it. The smallest grave belonged to another Michael, not this one, the first. Little Seamus Dunne had died almost exactly a year before, only 4 years old. The fever had taken him after weeks without proper food. Patrick still remembered carrying the tiny body across these same muddy fields, while Eileen could barely walk behind him for grief. No priest had been available that day. Too many children were dying. Too many funerals. Patrick cleared his throat. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The family joined quietly. Their voices were thin against the wind, and when the prayer ended, nobody moved. Eileen knelt and brushed away the weeds that had begun growing around the little wooden cross Patrick had carved himself. The wood had already begun to rot. "I wish we could have given you better, my darling," she whispered. Bridget began crying softly. Mary wrapped an arm around her sister. Patrick stared across the surrounding cemetery. There had once been spaces between the graves, now there were hardly any. Fresh earth lay everywhere. Some graves bore names, many did not. The walk home took nearly an hour. Home. Patrick wondered if the words still fit. The cottage roof leaked. The pig was gone. The chickens had been sold before Christmas. Their donkey had fetched enough money to buy oats that lasted less than 3 weeks. Every stick of furniture that wasn't absolutely necessary had disappeared into the market at Kilrush. The clock his father had built, gone. The spinning wheel, gone. Even Eileen's wedding ring had been traded to a merchant 6 months before. Only one thing remained, the shawl. Patrick noticed Eileen pulling it tighter. He knew exactly what she was thinking. He had been thinking it himself. Neither wanted to say the words aloud. Their field stretched behind the cottage. Patrick stopped walking. The children stopped with him. The potato ridges lay black. He crouched and pushed his fingers into the damp soil. There should have been life beneath it. Instead, rot. Again. His shoulders sagged. Michael coughed violently. Patrick looked up immediately. "Are you all right, lad?" "I'm grand." But nobody believed him. The cough lingered. Then came another. Eileen's face tightened with worry. Inside the cottage there was almost nothing left. A rough table, 3 stools, a straw mattress, 2 blankets, a cracked iron pot hanging over cold ashes. Mary searched the cupboard, though she already knew what she would find. Half a handful of oatmeal, 1 onion, nothing else. She looked at her mother. Eileen nodded slowly. "Make the porridge." "There isn't enough." "There never is." Mary added water, more water than oats. The mixture became little more than cloudy liquid. No one complained. When she poured it into wooden bowls, the children pretended not to notice how little each received. Patrick quietly pushed half his portion towards Michael. The boy frowned. "Da." "Eat." "But I've already had some." It was a lie. Michael knew it. Still, he obeyed. That night, Michael woke coughing. Not the dry cough from earlier. This one came deep from inside his chest. Eileen lit the last candle. Patrick sat beside the boy. His skin felt hot. Too hot. Michael tried smiling. "I'm sorry I woke everyone." "Hush now," Eileen said. She laid a cool cloth across his forehead. Patrick looked helplessly toward the empty shelf where medicines once stood. There had once been willow bark, honey, herbs. Now there was nothing. If only, Eileen whispered. Patrick knew what she meant. If only the crop had come. If only we'd money. She looked toward the peg beside the fireplace. The shawl hung there, neatly folded. Patrick followed her eyes. Silence filled the room. Finally he spoke. No. She didn't answer. We'll not sell it. Still she remained silent. It's all you have left of your mother. And what if it buys medicine? Patrick stared at the floor. It might. What use is a shawl if Michael dies? No answer came. The candle flickered. Outside, the wind battered the cottage. Patrick finally looked at his sleeping son. His breathing was becoming uneven. He swallowed hard. We'll see what tomorrow brings. Eileen turned away so he wouldn't see her tears, but he heard them. Morning brought no miracle. Michael was weaker. The field remained dead. The cupboard remained empty. Patrick stood outside alone. He looked across the land his father had farmed before him, land that had fed generations. Now it seemed determined to bury them instead. Behind him the cottage door opened. Eileen stepped outside, carrying the folded shawl. She held it carefully in both hands. I've made my decision, she said quietly. Patrick looked at the treasured cloth, then at his wife. He knew that whatever happened next would change their family forever. Week 2. The land that was never theirs. County Clare, Ireland, March 1847. Patrick stared at the shawl in Eileen's hands for what felt like an age. The morning mist still hung over the fields, softening the outlines of the stone walls that divided one tenant's misery from another's. The folds of the old wool caught the pale light, its faded blue and green thread still beautiful despite the years. Eileen's grandmother had woven much of it herself, or so her mother had always said. It had wrapped babies at their christenings, covered shoulders at weddings, and comforted mourners at wakes. Now it might be exchanged for a few shillings. Patrick reached out and gently folded it shut again. Not yet. Eileen looked into his eyes. Patrick, not yet. She wanted to argue, but she saw the pain behind his stubbornness. The shawl was more than cloth. It was the last proof that there had once been better days, days when family thought beyond the next meal. She nodded reluctantly. For today. For today. Patrick took his spade and walked into the fields. There were scarcely fields any more. The potato ridges lay black with decay, the disease having returned with a cruelty no one could understand. Last year's failure had left them weakened. This year's had shattered whatever hope remained. Yet beyond the ruined potatoes stood another crop, tall rows of oats battered by winter, and beyond those, corn. Not sweet corn as future generations would know it, but grain, hard, yellow kernels that could be ground into meal. Patrick stood looking at it. It was enough to keep his family alive for weeks, perhaps months, but it was not his, none of it. The land belonged to Lord Ashcroft, an English landlord who had not set foot in County Clare for nearly 20 years. Patrick had never met him, neither had his father, nor his grandfather. The estate was managed by an agent who visited only to collect rents and settle disputes, usually in favour of the landlord. Every season the agreement remained the same. Patrick was permitted a small plot where he might grow potatoes for his family. In return, much of the surrounding acreage had to be planted with crops that could be sold, corn, oats and barley. Those crops were not intended for the Dunne table. They were intended to pay the rent. If the rent was not paid, the family would lose everything. Patrick picked a single head of grain between his fingers. His stomach growled. The temptation was overwhelming. No one would notice a handful, then another, then a sack, but everyone knew the consequences if tenants began taking from the landlord's harvest. The grain was counted, measured, watched. Stealing from one's own field was still stealing. He let the stalks fall. Back at the cottage, Michael had barely touched the watery porridge Mary prepared. Every swallow seemed painful. His cough had deepened. When he thought no one was watching, he pressed a hand against his ribs and winced. Eileen noticed. She noticed everything. Does it hurt? He forced a smile. Only a little. You're lying. I don't want you worrying. She stroked his hair. A mother's heart worries whether you tell her or not. Bridget quietly sat beside her mother. I'll give you some of mine. She pushed half her breakfast towards him. Michael shook his head. You need it. I want you better. Neither child ate much. There was too little to divide. That afternoon, Patrick made the 3-mile walk towards Kilrush to see if anyone needed day labour. The road was crowded, not with carts carrying produce, with people. Families carrying bundles. Old men walking with sticks. Children too weak to play. Some were headed towards the workhouse. Others had already been turned away because it was full. Patrick passed cottages with doors hanging open. Several stood abandoned. Everyone knew what that meant. Either the family had left, or they no longer needed a home. At the harbour, ships sat at anchor. Patrick watched labourers loading sacks aboard one vessel. He walked closer. Every sack contained grain, good grain, clean grain, enough bread to feed hundreds. He stopped beside an elderly fisherman watching silently. Where's she bound? Patrick asked. Liverpool. Patrick nodded. Another ship waited nearby, and that one? Bristol. The old man spat into the water. They've been sailing every week. Patrick watched more carts arrive. Barley, oats, corn, butter packed into barrels, salted beef, enough food to keep half the parish alive. Instead, it disappeared across the sea. It doesn't seem right, Patrick murmured. The fisherman answered quietly, It isn't ours to keep. Patrick looked toward the workers. But it's grown here. Aye, by Irish hands. Aye, on Irish soil. The old man sighed, but owned by English paper. Patrick said nothing. There was no argument to make. The grain belonged to those who held the deeds. The hunger belonged to everyone else. He found no work. Too many men sought too few jobs. By late afternoon, he began the walk home. Halfway, he saw several horsemen approaching. The estate agent, Mr. William Pemberton. Beside him rode 2 assistants carrying ledgers. Patrick removed his cap. So, Dunne. Good afternoon, sir. I'll expect the spring rent within the fortnight. Patrick hesitated. The potato crop has failed again. So I've heard. The boy is ill. I'm sorry to hear it. There was little sympathy in the words. If I might have another month, Pemberton closed his ledger. The landlord expects payment. We've never missed before. The landlord expects payment. Patrick swallowed. The grain won't fetch its full price until harvest. Then I suggest you harvest successfully. Patrick almost laughed. Harvest successfully? As though hunger were simply poor planning. As you wish, sir. Pemberton adjusted his gloves. I would also remind you that no grain is to be removed before inspection. Patrick stiffened. We've taken none. I wasn't accusing you. The agent looked him squarely in the eye. I was reminding you. The horses moved on. Patrick watched them disappear over the hill, and his fists remained clenched long after they had gone. That evening the family gathered around a fire barely worth the name. Only a few scraps of turf remained. Patrick told them about the harbour. Mary looked confused. If there's food, there is, then why can't people eat it? Patrick searched for words an 11-year-old could understand. Because it belongs to someone else. But we grew it. We did. Then how can it belong to someone else? Patrick looked towards Eileen. She answered softly. When your grandfather rented this land, that was the bargain. We could grow potatoes for ourselves on a little patch, but the rest belonged to the landlord. The corn, the oats, the barley, they paid for the right to stay here. Mary frowned. So if we eat the corn, we're called thieves. But if we don't, no one finished the sentence. Everyone already knew. Long after the children had fallen asleep, Patrick and Eileen sat in silence. Michael's coughing echoed throughout the cottage every few minutes. Each cough sounded worse than the last. Finally, Eileen arose. She walked to the peg on the wall. She lifted down the shawl. This time Patrick didn't stop her. He watched as she carefully folded it into a small linen sack. I'll take it to Kilrush tomorrow. Patrick closed his eyes. What do you think it'll fetch? I don't know. Enough for medicine? I pray so. And if it isn't? She looked towards Michael's sleeping form. Then perhaps enough for another week. Patrick reached for her hand. It was cold. He realized it had been a long time since either of them had spoken aloud what both feared most. We may lose the farm. Eileen's voice was barely above a whisper. We may. And if we do? She looked around the empty cottage. There was almost nothing left to lose. Only each other, only the children, only hope itself. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of waves breaking against the Clare coast, indifferent to the suffering scattered across the land. Tomorrow, Eileen would walk to Kilrush carrying the last heirloom of her family. She prayed that somewhere in the town there remained someone wealthy enough to buy beauty from people who could no longer afford to remember it.